Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of The Barefoot Genealogist. Today we are talking about those genealogy brick walls. Every one of us hit them at some point or another. We can't find a woman's maiden name. We can't find out what happened to your great-grandfather after the 1940 census. You can't discover your great-great-grandparents' parents' names. Those brick walls all have different degrees of thickness and they're all constructed a little bit differently, but the strategies for breaking through them are fairly consistent. So today I'm just going to quickly run through some of those strategies and help you maybe think outside of the box a little bit so that you can break through your own brick walls. Let's go ahead and dive in. The first thing I'm going to recommend that you do is that you state a clear research problem. One of the challenges that we often have in family history, especially when we're new to this, is that we just kind of go wherever the research takes us. And that's great, but if you're trying to solve a specific problem, it's good to be really clear about what that problem is. It doesn't have to be anything fancy or formal. Sometimes it's just a matter of jotting down a few notes or formulating the question in your mind. Sometimes I will write it on a little Post-it and attach that Post-it to my computer screen so that it's right there in front of me as I research. But the idea is to just really clearly and specifically state your research problem so that you know what it is that you are looking for. Next up, you're going to want to back up a generation and review. Now, this might seem pretty elementary, but one of the challenges is that oftentimes we don't know what we already have. We already have records that we've collected about a specific generation of people, and oftentimes the answer is in those records. We just didn't know what the question was when we were working with those records originally. And so you may already have information in your possession that gives the answer to the question that you're trying to solve. So go back and review all of those records. Now, backing up a generation also means you need to make sure that you have identified all of the people in that previous generation. So for example, if I'm looking for my great-grandfather's parents, I want to make sure that I've identified my great-grandfather really clearly, that I know exactly who he is and who his other relationships are. I want to make sure that I know who his spouse is, who each of his children are, all of his children, not just the one that I'm descended from, because the clue to his parents' names may be in the names of his children, or there may be some record that they've created that gives me information about them. The woman he married may be a cousin on his mother's side, or maybe the daughter of a man that his father did business with. So you always want to make sure that at every generation, as you work your way through your family tree, that you've got really solid and complete information. You also want to make sure that you review those records to make sure that you've looked at original records. An index to a birth record does not provide nearly the information that an actual copy of that birth certificate might provide. And so sometimes you might have to go back and order some original records. Go back to that original source material to make sure that you're looking at the right things. Which leads me to the next step, which is that you need to make sure that you are using all the records. I once had a gentleman ask me in a genealogy conference that I was speaking at. He said, how many records do I need to find to prove what I'm trying to prove about somebody in my family tree? And I think he was hoping that I would say 2 of them or 3 of them, but the answer is all of them. A reasonably exhaustive search is the genealogical standard, and that means that you need to collect all the records about a person in your tree, especially for those where you have hit a brick wall. The reason you may have that brick wall is because you've misidentified someone based on a single piece of information, or even based on 2 or 3 pieces of information. And it could be that they have a 5th child out there that has a death certificate that actually lists the correct mother's maiden name. So always use all the records, and by all the records, I don't just mean all the censuses or trying to locate birth, marriage, or death records for everybody in the family. I also mean, did they leave a will? Were they ever mentioned in the newspaper? Did they ever purchase property? Have you looked at the maps about where that property is in relationship to the property of others? Which brings me to my next point, which is that you need to create a timeline. This is a really great brick wall strategy. It allows me, when I do this, to first of all put all of my information in chronological order and make sure that there are no gaps. If there are obvious gaps in my timeline, well, then I know that there's probably more information that I can find. Is there a city directory that I need to go to discover where they were during a particular 10 or 15 year period of time? Are there state censuses available that could help fill in some of those gaps? Is there an odd gap between the birth years of their children? Is there something that I could do to find out if they had another child in there? Was he gone serving at war during that time period? Or did he immigrate to another country for work for a period of time? A lot of different reasons why this timeline will help you see gaps and maybe lead you to additional records that might help you solve the particular brick wall that you are trying to solve. Timelines also help me to really clearly see the interplay or the interaction between the events in their lives. And then it helps me to look for those inconsistencies. Was just working on a case recently where we were trying to determine if two individuals were siblings or not because their marriage records listed the same father's name, but we weren't sure it was the same individual, just two men with the same name. And then it listed the same mother's first name, but different last names. And so I was trying really hard to determine what those inconsistencies were. I thought these two men were brothers, but putting this information all out side by side, some of those inconsistencies jumped off the page. There was a big gap in their age. That mother's maiden name was different. Ultimately, because I was able to look at those inconsistencies and lay them out side by side, we were able to determine that these men were actually an uncle and a nephew. They were not brothers as we had previously thought. So the two fathers listed in the marriage certificate were actually a father and son, a junior and a senior, and they just happened to both marry women named Mary. So you need to look for some of those inconsistencies. We see this sometimes in families where the first wife has died and you start to look at the list of children and you're not sure which children belong with which wife. And sometimes the earlier children will list the second wife as their mother. Again, those inconsistencies start to pop out. But when you lay them all down side by side, when you use a timeline format, when you try to account for those inconsistencies, you're going to discover that you're going to solve some of those brick walls just by using some logic based on what those inconsistencies are telling you. Now, sometimes those inconsistencies, and I'm going to spend a little more time on this particular point for a reason, sometimes those inconsistencies are actually just inconsistencies in the records that cause our brick walls. Things like somebody changed the spelling of their name or changed their surname altogether. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes there are transcription errors in the records that you are using because you haven't gone back to an original source. Sometimes you've made an assumption in a previous generation that has led you to put something in your tree that you can't account for. And the reason you can't locate a particular individual, the reason you've hit this brick wall, is because you've created a person that isn't a real person based on some inconsistencies in some records. So you have to be really careful. Even original documents can be wrong. Sometimes intentionally, more often than not in my experience, it's unintentional. People didn't know, many of them, how to read or write, so how their name was spelled or written or given might have been different at various times. A lot of people in my family, particularly my family from the South, bounced back and forth between middle names and given names at different times in their life. So sometimes we end up creating multiple people because we think they're two separate individuals when in fact they are one individual. Sometimes in my Southern families, they name children names that are very similar. I have families where there is a John and a Jonathan. You have things like that. People who think it's cute to name children with names that rhyme, and then somehow they get conflated into being one individual, when in fact they're two separate individuals. So there's a lot of reasons why records have inconsistencies. Sometimes people do lie about things for various reasons. Sometimes it's that the informant didn't know whether they were telling the census taker information about their household or whether they were providing information for their father's death certificate. Sometimes they just didn't know the information, and rather than saying they didn't know, sometimes they made stuff up. Or sometimes under the stress of the moment, they misspoke. And so a lot of different reasons that information gets recorded incorrectly, and then as that information gets copied and transcribed and indexed over time, sometimes there are errors that are introduced. Sometimes you just have things on an image. I've looked at census images where I can barely read it because it's so faded after time, or the handwriting is so terrible. And so lots of reasons why those inconsistencies occur, but we have to be able to account for them. We have to be able to explain them. And if we can't explain them, that could be some kind of a signal to us that we are looking at incorrect, inaccurate, incomplete, or added information that doesn't belong there. That brings me to my next point, which is to research the fan club. Now, this is a phrase you may have heard. If my information is correct, it was coined by Elizabeth Shown Mills, and she talks about the family, associates, and neighbors of the person that you are researching. Some people have morphed this acronym into meaning friends, associates, and neighbors, but regardless, the point is that we need to research all of the people in the life of the individual that is our brick wall. Who did they live near? Who signed their children's baptismal certificates as witnesses? Who did they purchase and sell property to? Who did they worship with? Who did they work with? All of that becomes important because very often we find that families migrated together, they immigrated together, they worshiped together, and consequently they intermarried. And so very often that friend or neighbor could be the clue that leads us back to the very town in Germany where our ancestor immigrated from, even though no record of our ancestors may state exactly where they were from. But those neighbors and associates and church members and people that their nephew married, right? All of those are individuals who may have come from the same place in Germany that they came from. And so it gives us the information, or it allows us to build up a pretty good case for information about where our person may be from. So researching the fan club is a huge, huge step. And I probably think out of all these things we've talked about today, it is the one that is the least used. So make sure that you're doing some of that collateral research. I don't necessarily put all those people in my tree. Neighbors, unless I can prove that there's a familial connection, don't automatically go into my family tree. But I do keep a notebook. Sometimes it's electronic. Sometimes it's just a piece of scratch paper next to me while I'm researching, to keep track of all of those things as I do that research so that I can ultimately connect the dots. And that brings me to my final point, which is that at some point we all need to just realize that we might need to ask for help. The reality of family history is that you don't know what you don't know, and there is a world of resources, genealogical resources, methodology resources, educational resources out there that will help us break through that brick wall. Somebody has knowledge of the information that we need to break through our brick walls. And sometimes it's just a matter of connecting with them. Now, I usually make sure that I've done all of those other things before I ask for help. I'm not looking for someone to do my research for me. I enjoy doing it way too much myself. But hopping on a Facebook group about, German genealogy and asking for somebody to help me translate a document or read a piece of handwriting that I've struggled with, I think is perfectly acceptable. There are message boards, there are Facebook groups, there are libraries, there are genealogical societies and courses that we can take, all sorts of resources that are available to us to receive the help that we need when we've done all that we can do to break through that brick wall. Well, hopefully these quick tips were useful for you. That's all I have for you today. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.